Good evening. How's everybody doing? Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house when we're gonna do a double page on a Thursday? And with that double page, we're gonna be back on schedule, doing Daf Yomi along with all the rest of the world on the schedule. Sharon in New Jersey, Shandora in the Bronx, Paula in the Great Northwest, and Bella in Florida, John in Maine, Sharon studying alongside Cy, the Talmud cat, Frank in San Pedro, Joseph in Massachusetts, Guy in Ohio, David in Indiana, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella saying shalom. Welcome, everybody. So, just very quickly, in the category of you can't make this stuff up, probably already heard about this, but there's, I'm sure it's not many, but there are some young people on TikTok who've rediscovered Osama bin Laden's letter to America, the ravings of a psychotic madman who killed 3,000 Americans. And these young people are saying, oh, my world has been shaken. Now I see everything through a new lens. How can you be the same after reading this letter? And getting millions of views and lots of positive comments. And there's just, I don't know what to say. There's just some kind of a vacuum of truth out there being filled with, emotional morons. I can't put it any other way. And these are the same morons, dangerous emotional morons, who, have been saying comments. There's a couple of creators. I'm pretty sure they're Chabad. They're definitely a frum couple, Moses and Zipporah. I see them on, on some of these platforms, and they share what it's like to live life as an Orthodox Jew, and why she wears a shadel, and why Reb's tefillin, and how they eat kosher when they go on vacation. They're such charming, sweet people. And they just did a post because they got a comment, Hitler was right. You should all burn in an oven. And just these, these protests that are exploding. Just before I came on, I heard that a bunch of these pro-Palestinian protesters drove 20 cars on the Bay Bridge in Oakland, stopped in the middle of the bridge, got out of their cars and threw their keys off the bridge. So there's these unfortunate people going home from work. They're going to be on that bridge, I don't know how many hours. There's this reductivist, moronic, dangerous, emotion-driven thinking that the whole world can be reduced into, white oppressors and brown oppressed people, irrespective of actual facts on the ground. Applying this, ridiculous analysis to the situation in Israel obviously makes no sense. I don't know what to say about all this. Except I find it frustrating and dangerous. And the way we're fighting back is to teach eternal wisdom, eternal truth. And please God, may cooler heads prevail. And if parents find that they have these kinds of youngsters in the house, somehow break through and not fail the children and make sure they understand that good is not relative. Good, what is good, evil is the absence of good, and what is good is the same. It's always the same. People change, things change. But God is good, and God told us what is good. And while our understanding of what is good may change, good is an absolute concept. And it takes, real education, not garbage education, which is the only thing I can understand is being responsible for this really flawed thinking that's out there in the world right now and causing harm. Our daughter at college, she's afraid. demonstrations against Jews, calling for the murder of Jews, the death of Jews. I mean, that was something that, a few Jew haters said behind closed doors up until recently. And now there's just an explosion of open, it's not even anti-Semitism, that's just not strong enough of a term. Open Jew hatred, calling for the deaths of Jews. Why should we be surprised? It's the oldest hate there is. All right, let's do our part to promote truth and eternal values and real wisdom and clear-headed thinking. By the way, we just released a video today. It's on our Facebook page, and if you're on our email list, you'll be getting the email. Our app is very close. The video shows you exactly what it's going to be like. It's beautiful. It's going to enable many more people to learn Torah with us and without having to go through social media to do it. We're very excited about it. We do need some help completing it and launching it. Our funds at Accidental Talmudist are seriously depleted this year because it was very expensive to create the app. So we need your help. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. After the class, just scroll back one or two posts on our Facebook page and you can see the video and see what the app is really like. Make sure you join our email list. You could do that at accidentaltalmudist.org. But we're really excited about the app. I mean, it's a game changer. It's amazing. All our content is going to be available on it. And it's just a beautiful, really beautiful design, really efficient and useful, user-friendly app. Super excited about it, but we need your help. We definitely need your help now donating to our annual campaign so we can get that done. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. All right, our daf, our 2 pages, 13 and 14, Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet. We're going to pick this up near the top of page 13a, where we left off in our discussion of Mishna number 2 here in chapter 1. We're in Bava, Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're talking about damages. If you injure another party, you're going to have to pay damages. And if you only caused part of the damages, but the person was fully damaged, let's say, right? Like, in other words, your ox and somebody else's ox, or you were partially responsible for an ox that got free and hurt somebody. Well, you're, in many situations, going to be fully liable for the damage that ox does. And as part of that discussion, we continue. So, there was a baraisa that was in yesterday's page and in the discussion, and it teaches that concerning one who steals another's property, because, our Mishna also said that it's going to be a different case if your ox damages, for example, an ox that was consecrated and that belongs to the temple or belongs to God, as it were. So that's going to be a different situation than if your ox damages an ox that belongs to another individual, a private individual. So the Brisa teaches concerning one who steals another's property. Right now we're defining what does it mean that something is consecrated or that it's not consecrated. I mean, obviously, if you make a donation to the Holy Temple when the temple is standing, okay, that object now belongs to the temple. It's been consecrated. But as we were discussing yesterday, there are offerings of lesser sanctity, like peace offerings or a bechor, the firstborn animal, which need to, a peace offering is a voluntary offering. It's not an obligatory offering. And the person who brings it is going to eat much of it. It's for him to eat, right? It's often accompanying like the Pesach when that is brought at Passover. Or the firstborn animal, which will not be sacrificed if it is blemished. Now, these offerings of lesser sanctity, they only become fully consecrated, shall we say, when they're handed over to a priest in the temple. And prior to that, they're considered the property of their owners, even though the owner has said, I'm designating this to be a peace offering, or I know that this is a firstborn animal. But if it's still in the realm of its owner and your ox damages it, well, then you owe the owner damages. It's not really consecrated property yet. So we're making that kind of a distinction. And as part of that conversation, we learn that concerning one who steals another's property, and takes a false oath denying that he has done so, incurring the obligation to bring a guilt offering in addition to the fine for stealing. The verse states, Leviticus 5:21, that one commits a trespass against the Lord and deals falsely with his neighbor. And that verse serves to include a case in which one denies having in his possession offerings of lesser sanctity that he stole from someone, which are still considered the property of their owners. And they are included in the phrase, and deals falsely with his neighbor. This is the statement of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. Ben Azai says, this phrase serves to include peace offerings. Abba Yosef ben Dostai says, Ben Azai said this only with regard to a firstborn offering. So the master said in the Baraisa, Ben Azai says, the phrase serves to include peace offerings. And the Gemara asks, Ben Azai's interpretation of the phrase, limiting its interpretation to a reference only to peace offerings, so what does he come to exclude? If we say it is to exclude a firstborn offering because he holds that a firstborn is not the property of the priest, one could reject this, as the sanctity of a firstborn offering is a lesser sanctity than that of a peace offering, as follows. Now, just as with regard to peace offerings, which have a higher degree of sanctity such that they require placing hands on the head of the offering and are accompanied by libations and the waving of their breast and the right hind leg by the priest and owner together, you nevertheless say that it is the property of the owners. Is it necessary to state that with regard to a firstborn offering, for which these laws do not apply, that the priest has ownership of it? Right, so we say that the priest only sort of, if he acquires ownership, right, for example, the priestly portions of a sin offering, he doesn't acquire that until it's already been offered on the altar, and then a part is set aside to give to the priest. And could a priest betroth a woman with that portion that he's given to eat? And we say no, because he's actually just eating from the table of the Lord. It belongs to the Lord. It doesn't belong to the priest. But we don't say that about the firstborn, which is given to a priest. It is given to him, but it's not given to him until it's handed over, even though from the time it was born, it was a firstborn. Now, we're going to skip a few paragraphs because we're doing a double daf. So, the Gemara, about halfway down 13a, so the Gemara cites an alternative explanation of the statement in our Mishna, Mishna number 2 here in chapter 1. So Rava said, what does the Mishna mean when it says, one is liable only for damage caused to property, for which, if one was to use it for a mundane purpose, one would not be liable for the misuse of consecrated property? So it sounds like he's saying, no, so you're only going to be liable for damage for something that is not consecrated, right? If it is consecrated, meaning that, right, if it had been consecrated as a donation to the temple, and then you used it for personal gain, so you would have committed me'ila, the transgression of misappropriating consecrated property. So according to this reading, so if you damage consecrated property, you're going to have some kind of an issue with the temple and what you owe and what you need to replace. But in terms of paying damages under this law of damages, it doesn't apply because it belongs to the temple. It belongs to God, not to your fellow Jew. So Rava said, what does the Mishnah mean when it says one is liable only for damage caused to property, which were once to use it for a mundane purpose, one would not be liable for the misuse of consecrated property? Says Rava, it is referring to property that is not at all subject to the laws of misuse of consecrated property. And what is that? It's referring to any property of an ordinary person. Right? So Rava is saying, wait, no. If it's got any aspect of consecration, then this doesn't apply, right? In other words, he's saying that we're only talking about you pay damages to property that's owned by a private individual. If it's consecrated in any way, then the damages don't apply. So Rav is being a lot more expansive in his interpretation than what we were talking about until now, that no, offerings of lesser sanctity would be included in this because they're still in the domain of their owners. And the Gemara asks, but then let the Mishnah teach explicitly. One is liable only for damage caused to the property of an ordinary individual. And the Gemara concedes, yes, this is difficult. In other words, it wasn't taught that way. So if we're going to hold like Rava, that it only means property of individuals, no aspect of consecration, then the Mishnah is difficult. But if we hold like the other view we encountered earlier, that it includes offerings of lesser sanctity while still in the domain of their owners, then it makes sense. New subject. Rabbi Abba says, with regard to the case of an innocuous animal, right, one that has not been known to endanger people by goring in the past, goring or other kinds of attack, right, but an animal that is not, we have no reason to suspect that this is a dangerous animal. So with regard to the case of an innocuous animal that was consecrated as a peace offering, and that animal caused damage. So now we're talking about something that an animal that is consecrated and then it causes the damage rather than being on the receiving end of the damage. So regarding this innocuous animal that was consecrated as a peace offering and it caused damage, so the injured party collects damages from its meat. Right? Once it's consecrated as a peace offering, remember that it's going to be slaughtered in the temple. Its blood is going to be spilled on the altar. There's parts that are going to be burned on the altar. And then the rest of the meat is going to be given to the owner, who's going to presumably eat it in Jerusalem with his family, celebrating the festival, which is when peace offerings were typically brought. So now, if that animal, after it's already been designated, consecrated as a peace offering, damages somebody else's animal, so the injured party has a right to collect, but only from that animal after it gets slaughtered and its meat is given back to the owner. So the injured party can only collect from that meat, not from the whole living animal, as it were. And this is in accordance with the general law that the payment for damage caused by an innocuous ox is collected exclusively from the proceeds of the sale of the body of the ox and not from any other property of its owner. But the injured party does not collect the damages from the sacrificial portions of the innocuous ox that was consecrated as a peace offering. So the Gemara asks, isn't it obvious that one collects exclusively from the meat portion and not from the sacrificial portions, as those are offered up to God on the altar when peace offerings are brought, when the temple is standing? So the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary for Rabbi Abba to teach that there is no collection from the owner's meat portions corresponding to the sacrificial portions. Payment for damage caused by an innocuous animal is half the amount of the damages incurred by the injured party, because it was an innocuous animal. If it was a forewarned animal that had, endangered others or injured others in the past, then the owner would be liable for the full amount of the damages. But now that we're talking about an ox that had been consecrated for peace offering, that the injured party can only collect from the meat of that ox, right? No, it is necessary for Rabbi Abba to teach that there is no collection from the owner's meat portions corresponding to the sacrificial portions. Payment for damage caused by an innocuous animal is half the amount of the damages and can be no more than the value of the animal itself. Rabbi Abba is teaching that when assessing the damage to determine the amount to be paid, one deems the owner responsible only according to his share of the animal, i.e., the meat portions in relation to the animal as a whole, because that's what he's going to receive back for him and his family to eat. The rest of the animal has been consecrated as a gift to God, and that's not going to be available to make whole somebody who was injured by it. Rabbi Nassan and the rabbis engage in a dispute concerning the law in a case in which an ox pushed another animal into a pit. If it were an innocuous, we have two forms of damager, as it were, working together, right? Somebody has an ox. That ox is going to be injured. How was it injured? Well, it was pushed by another person's ox into a third person's pit, right? So now you have a combination of forces. One who dug a pit that ended up, causing damage to somebody's animal in the public domain, and somebody's ox, perhaps an innocuous ox, perhaps a forewarned ox, that pushed, right, another person's ox into that pit. Now, if it was an innocuous ox, he's only going to be liable for half of the damages that were actually sustained by the victim ox. Whereas if an ox is damaged in a pit, the owner of the pit is responsible for the whole value of the damages sustained by the victim ox. So what happens when someone's ox combines with somebody else's pit to harm a third person's animal? We're going to encounter that on 53a, but it's referred to here. If it were an innocuous ox for which the Torah limits the owner's liability to half the damages, the rabbis rule that liability is incurred exclusively by the owner of the ox, i.e., he pays half the value of the damage, and the owner of the pit is entirely exempt. And Rabbi Nassan holds that since the damage was caused jointly by the ox and the pit, the owner of the ox need pay only half of what he would pay if his animal had been solely responsible, thus 1/4 of the damages. Rabbi Nassan further rules that the remaining sum can then be fully recovered from the owner of the pit, i.e. he pays the remaining 3/4 of the damages. And the Gemara asks, in accordance with whose opinion of those Tanaim does Rabbi Abba state his ruling, with the majority or with Rabbi Nassan in that other Mishnah? If it is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, then it is obvious that there is no need to state it, as did the rabbis say. Whenever, for whatever reason, the full cost of the damage cannot be recovered from this party, it is not recovered from that party. I.e., even though the injured animal suffered the loss of the injured party suffered the loss of the full value of his animal and recovered only half of its value from the owner of the ox, he may not demand the remaining sum from the owner of the pit. And so too in this case, where the injured party cannot collect damages from the sacrificial portions, he cannot recover that loss from the meat portions of the one who brought the offering. And that's where we're going to leave off with that subject and skip a few paragraphs down on 13b. I'm going to just read one more paragraph, though. And if it is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Nassan, doesn't he say, whenever the full cost of the damage cannot be recovered from this one, it is recovered from that one? In other words, if an innocuous ox hurts my ox in the public domain, the most that I stand to get back is half the value of my ox, because that's what the Torah says. But if my ox was pushed by that ox into a pit, that's why we can see Rabbi Nassan makes a good point. Why not also bring in the owner of the pit to participate in making me whole? Why not? But we'll encounter that Mishnah further on in our journey through Bava Kamma. So we skip some paragraphs further down on 13b. So one is liable only for assigned property. That's back to our Mishnah that we're discussing here. And the Gemara asks, this clause serves to exclude what? Meaning that ownerless property as opposed to assigned property. Assigned property means that it has an owner and we know who the owner is. So the Gemara asks, this clause serves to exclude what? Rav Yehuda said this clause serves to exclude a case in which an animal is injured, but it is unclear which of two oxen owned by two different people caused the damage. So it's not only that we have to know, in other words, we have to know that there is an injured party, but we also have to know who is the damaging party, right? So only one ox caused the harm, but we don't know if it was, Reuven's ox or Shimon's ox. So do we say, well, it was definitely one of those two oxen? And since we don't know which, okay, so Reuven and Shimon, you're both responsible. You guys split the value of the damages to make the injured party whole. Or rather, do we say, well, we don't know which ox caused the damage. We cannot know, and therefore no one is liable because we're not going to bring an innocent person whose ox didn't do any harm into the mix. Sounds like it's the second choice. Right, Rav Yehuda said this clause serves to exclude a case in which an animal is injured, but it is unclear which of two oxen owned by different people caused the damage. The owner of this ox says to the owner of the other, your ox caused the damage. And that owner says, no, your ox caused the damage. And since it cannot be proven which ox actually caused the damage, neither owner is liable. The intention of the Mishnah is that one is liable only where the belligerent ox is assigned to, i.e., is known to be the property of a specific individual. So the Gemara asks, isn't that explicitly taught in the Mishnah on page 35a? If two oxen were seen pursuing a single ox, and then the single ox is found to be injured, and the owner of this ox says to the owner of the other, your ox caused the damage, and that other owner says, no, your ox caused the damage, well, both of them are exempt, since it is uncertain which one is guilty. And the Gemara answers, the Tana teaches this as a principle in the Mishnah here, and then he explains it in greater detail in that Mishnah on page 35. Now, it was taught in a Baraisa, an explanation of the Mishnah, that the term assigned property serves to exclude ownerless property. That's where I went to in my thinking. And the Gemara clarifies what are the circumstances in which the Mishnah teaches that one is exempt if we say it is referring to a case where an ox belonging to us, i.e. to a Jew, gored an ownerless ox. It is obvious that the owner bears no liability, as who is claiming damages from him? Rather, it must be referring to a case where an ownerless ox gored an ox belonging to us, and it teaches that the injured party does not have a right to damages. Well, sure, who would he ask? And the Gemara asks, so what is the point of the law? If the injured party wishes to recover his losses, let him go and take the belligerent ox for himself, since it is currently ownerless. And the Gemara explains the Mishnah teaches that the injured party does not have any right to the ox, in order to teach that in a case where another person preceded him and acquired it, the injured party has no claim to it. Now, Ravina said an alternative interpretation of that Mishnah. The term assigned property serves to exclude a case in which an ox gored and subsequently its owner consecrated it, or where the ox gored and subsequently the owner declared it ownerless. Since the owners did not own the ox at the time that they owned the ox when it did the damage, but then they gave it away, either declared it ownerless or consecrated it. So at the time of the trial before the rabbinic court, they were no longer the owner. So what happened? Since the owners did not own the ox at the time the case was brought before the court, they are exempt from paying. And Ravina explains that this is the intention of the Mishnah, that one is liable only when the property that caused the damage was owned, is liable only when the property that caused the damage was owned by a responsible party, both when it caused the damage and when it was tried before the court. In this case, at the time of the court hearing, was not owned by a responsible party, as it was either consecrated or ownerless. Now, this makes sense because you can only recover this kind of damage from the value of the damaging ox itself, and now that's been given away. So it's not like the damager wins. He still got rid of his ox. He's still out an ox. And that most of his liability was limited to the value of the ox that caused the harm, as we learned earlier tonight. Now, it is also taught in a Baraisa, the law is that an ox that kills a person is stoned to death. And the Mishnah states on page 44b that this does not apply to an ox consecrated to the temple or an ownerless ox. Really? If an ox gored a human being and killed him, if the goring ox was owned by a person, okay, it's stoned to death. But if it's owned by the temple or if it's ownerless, then we don't. Now, does that to say that we don't use stoning to kill the ox, but we do kill it, or we don't kill it at all? Let's keep reading. Moreover, Rabbi Yehuda said, even if an ox gored and its owner subsequently consecrated to the temple, or if an ox gored and its owner subsequently declared it ownerless, the owner is exempt from liability, as it is stated, and if the ox was wont to gore in time past and had been forewarned with its owner, and he had not guarded it, and it killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and also its owner shall be put to death. Now, the repetition of the reference to the owner at the beginning and end of the verse indicates that the ox is not stoned unless the ox's status as the owner's property at the time of the death of the victim and at the time of the owner's standing trial is the same, i.e. the ox is owned by the responsible party for both events, right? The goring and the trial. Now the Gemara asks, but do we not also require that the ox's status be the same at the time of the verdict? Isn't the phrase, the ox shall be stoned, written with regard to the time of the verdict? So it has to be owned by the person when the goring happened, when the trial was brought, and when the verdict was read. So rather say that the owner of the ox is exempt unless the ox's status as the owner's property at the time of the death of the victim and at the time of the owner's standing trial and at the verdict is the same, i.e. the ox is owned by a responsible party for all three events. So right away you might think, well, if that tragedy happened and your ox killed a person, obviously what you were going to do is get rid of the ox right away. That's not my ox. It was, but not anymore. I am no longer associated with that ox. And if the trial is found, to be that the ox really killed a person, the ox is responsible. It's not going to be my problem because I'm getting rid of the ox right now. I throw up my hands, and is that a way to escape liability by a person who should be responsible? I'm not sure. Let's just keep reading. Now, the Mishna teaches one is liable for damage caused in any place except for a domain designated exclusively for the use of the one responsible for the damage. Hold on one second. That is the law. What can I say? If an ox causes damages and then prior to the trial, the owner consecrates it or declares it to be ownerless, he is exempt from all liability. And this is the law unless he reclaims ownership of the ox before anyone else succeeds in doing so. So there you go. Now, this is obviously not something that's going to come up very often. And, before we get too riled up, it's not like he walked into the market that day thinking that his ox was going to kill someone. It's only a case of negligence, not some kind of willful murder. But still, we don't like it, right? We don't like it that he would have been liable except that he gave away the ox and now he's not. But we also know that a court, in terms of issuing a death penalty in a negligence case, they're going to find some way out of that. They're just, the death penalty was so seldom used. Where was I? Okay, so the Mishnah teaches one is liable for damage caused in any place except for a domain designated exclusively for the use of the one responsible for the damage. In other words, if my ox is on my farm and your ox walks onto my farm and then gets gored by my ox, I don't owe you anything. You should have kept your ox off my property, right? The Gemara explains that the reason for this is because the one liable for the damage can say to the injured party, what did your ox want in my domain? One does not have to guard his ox from causing damage within his own property, since another person's animal has no right to be there. And the Mishnah continues, and one is liable for damage caused in a domain designated for the joint use of the injured party and the one liable for the damage, right? But if we co-own the farm, and, my ox kills your ox, then I am going to be liable. So the Gemara cites a dispute concerning this case that results in two different ways of interpreting the Mishnah. Rav Chisda says that Avimi says, with regard to a courtyard designated for the joint use of two partners, either one of them is liable for damage caused by the ox of one party, of one partner, to the property of the other partner while in it, both for the category of eating and for the category of trampling. And accordingly, this is what the Mishnah is saying. One is liable for damage caused in any place except for a domain designated exclusively for the use of the one responsible for the damage, as he is exempt there. But in a domain designated for the joint use of the injured party and one responsible for the damage, when he causes damage, the one who is responsible for the damage is obligated to pay. Skip a couple of paragraphs. The master said that the Mishna states when an animal or item that one is responsible to safeguard causes damage, the one liable for the damage caused by insufficiently safeguarding it is obligated to pay payments of restitution for damage. And this serves to include the cases of an unpaid bailee, a borrower, a paid bailee, and a renter. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances? So if we say that the lender's ox, right? I own an ox and I am lending it to a borrower. Somebody's going to Reuven is going to borrow my ox, okay? So if we say that the lender's ox, which was under the watch of the borrower, injured the borrower's ox, and the Baraisa is teaching that the lender is liable to pay the borrower, why is this so? Let the lender say to the borrower, if my ox had injured an ox in the world at large, i.e. someone else's ox, you, the borrower, would be required to pay as you were entrusted with safeguarding it. Now that my ox has injured your ox, should I be required to pay? Once you borrowed my ox and took it off my property, you're the borrower. Now that ox is your responsibility. If while you borrowed my ox, it ends up harming some other ox of yours, why is that my problem? You're responsible for the ox while you borrowed it. So that must not be the circumstances that we're talking about. So rather, the case must be that the borrower's ox injured the lender's ox. And the Baraisa is teaching that the borrower is liable to pay. Now that makes sense. You come, you borrow my ox, now it's in your care, your responsibility. And while it's under your responsibility, that ox ends up goring one of my oxen that you didn't borrow. Well, of course, even though I own both oxen, the one that you were entrusted to take care of, to safeguard, because you borrowed it, harmed my ox. So yeah, you're liable because it was in your care. That makes sense. So the Gemara asks, according to this interpretation, the Baraisa teaches that if the belligerent ox was innocuous, the borrower is liable to pay only half the damages, right? It was not a forewarned ox, was not known to be a goring, dangerous ox. So the borrower who borrowed my ox and it gored my other ox, now he has to pay half the damages that the borrowed ox caused. Okay, that makes sense. But why? Let the lender say to the borrower, by borrowing my ox, you undertook full responsibility for it, such that if my ox had been injured by an ox from the world at large, you would be required to pay me for the entire value of my ox, irrespective of whether the belligerent ox was considered innocuous or forewarned. Now that it is your ox that injured my ox, should you have to pay only half of the damages? This interpretation of the Baraisa is also difficult. So the Gemara explains, actually the case is where the lender's ox injured the borrower's ox. And with what are we dealing here? This is a case where the borrower undertook the responsibility of safeguarding the body of the lender's ox from being injured, but he did not undertake the responsibility of safeguarding the lender's ox to prevent it from causing damage. Accordingly, the lender remains responsible for his ox, and if it caused damage to the borrower's ox, the lender is liable as in any other case in which his ox caused damage. So the Gemara asks, well, if that is so, and we are on 14a now, if that is so, say, and try to explain accordingly the latter clause of the Baraisa. If the ox was safely enclosed and a wall broke open at night, or if bandits broke it open and the ox went out and caused damage, the bailee is exempt from liability. And the Gemara infers if it broke open during the day and then caused damage, he is liable. And the Gemara asks, according to the interpretation offered in explanation of the previous clause, the Baraisa concerns a case in which one borrowed an ox but did not undertake the responsibility to prevent it from causing damage. If so, how can the latter clause imply that there are cases in which he is liable if he did not undertake the responsibility of safeguarding the lender's ox to prevent it from causing damage? He should never be liable for the damage that it caused. And the Gemara answers that the latter clause of the Baraisa concerns a different case than that of the previous clause. This is what the latter clause of the Baraisa is saying. If, by contrast, the borrower did undertake the responsibility of safeguarding the lender's ox to prevent it from causing damage, then if it causes damage, the borrower is liable. But if the ox was safely enclosed and the wall enclosing it broke open at night, or bandits broke it open and the ox went out and caused damage, then he is exempt because that's beyond the scope of the responsibility that he was undertaking. It was not foreseeable. Okay, we're going to skip several paragraphs, sort of 2/3 of the way down on 14a. The Gemara returns to the matter itself and analyzes the Baraisa and the Tosefta cited above. It states, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar would state 4 principles with regard to the liability incurred based on where the damage was caused. So with regard to any location that is the property of the injured party and is not the property of the one liable for the damage, so the owner of the animal that causes the damage is liable for all the damage caused there, right? If my animal goes onto your property and damages some animal of yours, I'm fully liable, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. If a place is the property of the one liable for the damage and not the property of the injured party, then the owner of the animal that causes the damage is fully exempt, right? If your animal wanders onto my property and my animal hurts your animal, I'm not liable at all because your animal shouldn't have been on my property. So the Gemara infers that the Baraisa does not teach one is liable for any damage caused there, which would suggest that one is liable for all types of damage. Rather, it teaches one is liable for all the damage caused, which can be translated as for the full cost of the damage. So this indicates that even where one's ox considered to be innocuous and cause damage of the category of goring, which would generally incur liability only for half the value of the damage, in this case, if my ox went onto your property and gored your ox, so even though it's an innocuous ox, and normally I would only be liable for half the value of the damages you incurred, if my ox was on your property when it did that, I'm going to owe you the full value, according to this view. Now, whose opinion is this? It is Shimon ben Elazar, right? But in accordance with who? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, who says the law, the halacha of cases of goring performed by an innocuous animal, which is atypical, it's innocuous, done in the courtyard of the injured party, is that the owner of the ox pays the full cost of the damage, even if the ox is innocuous. Perfect. That is what we said before, so Rabbi Tarfon squares with Shimon ben Elazar. Says the Gemara, if this is so, say and try to explain accordingly the latter clause of the Baraisa. If a place where the damage occurs is the property of neither this one nor that one, for example, a courtyard that is not owned by either of them. Okay, so it happened in a private domain, but not my property, not your property. So both of our animals were on somebody else's property, and my animal gored your animal. Well, presumably, if it was an innocuous ox, it was my ox, it hurt yours, so I would be liable for half the damage. Maybe. Let's see. So if the place where the damage occurs is the property neither of this one nor of that one, for example, a courtyard that is not owned by either of the two of them, then the owner of an animal that causes damage is liable for eating and for trampling performed by the animal in that place. Well, eating and trampling, okay, so what am I damaging? Not another animal, presumably, but produce. So the Gemara asks, what does the Baraisa mean by saying the property is of neither this nor that one? If we say the intention of the Baraisa is that the property is of neither this one nor that one at all, but rather belongs to another person, why should either partner be liable? But don't I need a case that fits the depiction of the verse, and it consumed in a field of another, which is understood to mean that the consumed produce belongs to the owner of the field in which the act of consumption occurred. And since the injured party does not have any rights to this place, it does not fulfill this condition. So rather, it is obvious that the intention of the Baraisa is that the property is of neither this one nor that one together. Rather, it belongs to only one of them. i.e. the injured party. And the latter clause teaches if the ox is innocuous, the owner pays half the value of the damage, and if it is forewarned, he pays the full cost of the damage. Well, if so, in the latter clause, we arrive at the opinion of the rabbis, who say the law of cases of goring performed by an innocuous animal, which is atypical, occurring in the courtyard of the injured party, is that the owner of the ox pays half the value of the damage, like would happen even if it was in the public domain. Doesn't matter that my ox walked onto your property. It's an innocuous ox. It gored. I still am only liable for half the value of the damage. So the Gemara asks, could it be that the first clause of the Brisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon, and the last clause is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis? And the Gemara answers, yes. That is, as Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda with regard to a different Mishnah, the one on page 15b. He said, Shinana, right? Sharp-toothed one, smart one. Leave the Mishnah and follow after me and my interpretation that the first clause of the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon and the last clause is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. In this Baraisa as well, different clauses within the same Baraisa can be in accordance with different sages. So the Gemara presents a different interpretation of the, not so, but now the Gemara presents a different interpretation of the Baraisa. Ravina said in the name of Rava, the entire Baraisa is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Tarfon. And what does it mean by saying that the property of neither this one nor that one? The property does not belong both to this one and that one. Rather, it is designated for the use of only one of them, for him to keep his produce there. Only the injured party has the right to keep his produce there. But it is designated for both this one and for that one for them to keep their oxen there, as both have this right. So accordingly, with regard to damage of the category of eating, the property is considered to be the courtyard of the injured party. Therefore, since he's the one who's allowed to keep produce there, therefore the one responsible for the damage is liable to pay for the damage. By contrast, with regard to the damage of the category of goring, since they both have the right to keep their oxen there, the property is considered to be like the public domain. And therefore, even Rabbi Tarfon agrees that if one's innocuous ox causes damage there, one is liable for only half the value of the damage. And the Gemara asks, if that is so, does the Baraisa list if that is so, does the Baraisa list 4 principles? There are only 3. In other words, according to the way Ravina explains the latter clause, the 4th principle, it does not teach anything that is not already known from the first 3 principles, as the fact that one is liable for eating and trampling and property designated for the use of the injured party is explicitly stated in the first principle. And the fact that one is liable for only half the cost of the damage in the case of goring in jointly owned courtyard is expressed in the 3rd principle. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, yeah, there are only 3 distinct principles, but they are listed as 4 cases because they apply in 4 different places. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2. Here's Mishnah number 3, and now we're on page 14b. The determination of payment of damages, right? So if my animal hurts your animal, and so now I'm going to be liable for damages, how much, right? And how do we know that, is that you said my animal damaged yours, so I owe you, right? This is why we bring a court into this, right? There's going to be some kind of an action before a judge. So the determination of payment of damages, how much now we're talking about, is made by monetary appraisal. One pays with items worth money. This law applies before a court. And it is based upon the testimony of witnesses who are free men, i.e., men who are not Canaanite slaves, and who are members of the covenant, meaning that they are Jews, because this is a rabbinic court. And women are included in the laws of damages in the same way as men. And both the injured party and the one liable for the damage are involved in the payment, and the Gemara will explain all these principles. That's Mishnah number 3. Here comes the Gemara. What is the meaning of the determination of payment of damages is made by monetary appraisal? So Rav Yehuda says this appraisal of the damage caused should be made only in terms of the monetary value of the damage. Right? Now we're not talking about pain, humiliation, loss of livelihood, etc. We're only talking about physical damage. The Gemara notes, we learn in this Mishnah, this law that the sages taught explicitly, in a case in which a cow damaged a cloak, and the cloak injured the cow. For example, the cow tread on the cloak, thereby damaging it, and then the cow became entangled in the cloak became entangled in the cow's legs, causing the cow to trip, and then the cow was injured. So one does not say that it may be presumed that the damage to the cow is offset by the damage to the cloak, and the damage to the cloak is offset by the damage to the cow, and therefore the owners of both are exempt from any payment. Rather, the court appraises separately the damage caused to each side in terms of its monetary value, and only then calculates to what extent the liabilities offset each other. So presumably we're saying, well, the cloak was left lying around where someone could trip on it, so that was a hazard. And the cow was walking around unattended and could hurt somebody, so that was a hazard. And now these two, negligent objects came into, contact with each other and damaged each other. So who owes who how much, right? That's what we're saying. Now the Mishnah continues, with items worth money, to what does this refer? This is as the sages taught in Baraisa. Payment is made with items worth money. This teaches that the court attends to the collection of damages only in order to collect from property that serves as a guarantee, meaning land. But if the injured party proceeded of his own accord to seize movable property from the one liable for the damage, so then the court collects damages for him from those items he seized. According to the Baraisa, the phrase items worth money is referring to land. The Gemara analyzes this. The master said in the Baraisa, payment is made with items worth money. And this teaches that the court attends to the collection of damages only in order to collect from property that serves as a guarantee, meaning land. So the phrase items worth money, therefore, is used as a term for land. And the Gemara asks, from where is this inferred? And Rabba Bar Ula says that the phrase items worth money is referring to something that is worth any amount of money. And what is that? It is something that is not subject to price fraud, which is the law with regard to land. Unlike the sale of movable property, the sale of land is valid irrespective of the sum for which the land is sold. And the Gemara challenges this explanation. But slaves and documents are also not subject to price fraud. Yet these are not included in the phrase items worth money, as the court does not collect payments of damages from them. So rather, Rabba Bar Ula said the phrase is referring to something that is acquired with money, which is the law with regard to land, but not with regard to movable property. We learned that on Kiddushin 26a. And the Gemara rejects this explanation also, but slaves and documents are also acquired with money. So rather, Rav Ashi said the phrase is referring to something that is worth money, but is not actually money. And all these things, movable property, slaves, and documents, are considered like actual money because they have the defining characteristics of money in that they are valuable and portable, unlike land. You can see why a court would have to get involved where in order to pay damages, you're going to seize land. How are you going to seize it? Where are you going to seize it? How are you going to say it's yours? If he says, no, it's not yours, right? A court has to get involved when land is going to change hands in order to pay off damages. As opposed to movable property, which you could just grab it. Now, you might still have to go to court to prove that you were entitled to grab that property. Or let's say you guys came to an agreement. I'm sorry, my cow damaged yours. I'll pay you with this, pile of bran. So you come over, you take the whole pile. And then the guy says, wait a minute, I didn't mean the whole pile. I meant that you could take a few scoops. Well, you said the whole pile. Now they're arguing. Now they end up in court. Now, Rav Yehuda Bar Chinana raises a contradiction. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Yehuda Bar Hinana raised a contradiction to the opinion of Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua. In the Baraisa cited earlier, it is taught the Mishna's statement that payment is made with items worth money teaches that the court attends to the collection of damages only in order to collect from property that serves as a guarantee, meaning land. But it is taught also in another Baraisa, the verse states the superfluous phrase, he shall recompense, Exodus 21:34, to include items worth money and even a pile of bran, a relatively inferior commodity. So the first Baraisa teaches that only land is a valid form of payment, whereas the second Baraisa seems to teach that one may pay even with movable property. And the Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? And the Baraisa that teaches that the court collects damages Only from land? We are dealing with a case where damages are collected from orphans whose father was liable to pay damages. And the Brisa teaches that the liability inherited by the orphans applies only to the land they inherited from their father, as it is liened to their father's debts, as opposed to any cash or movable property, which is not. You can't collect from orphans with respect to cash or movable property, only from land. So the Gemara asks, if the Brisa is referring to collection from orphans, say and try to explain accordingly the latter clause of the Brisa. But if the injured party proceeded of his own accord to seize movable property from the one liable for the damage, the court collects damages from him from those items that he seized. And the Gemara asks, if, as suggested, the Brisa is referring to collection from orphans, why does the court collect damages for him from those items that he seized, as the father's movable property is not subject to a lien for debt? And the Gemara answers the cases like that which Rava says, that Rav Nachman says, with regard to the Mishna Ketubos 84a, which teaches that creditors who seize movable property as payment for a debt may keep those items. That is referring to a case in which he seized the property while the debtor was still alive. Here also, the Brisa is referring to a case in which the creditor seized the property while the one liable for the damage, not the creditor, but the injured party, seized the property while the one that was liable for the damage was still alive. If he died before seizing the property and he has to go to the orphans, it's only from land that he can be paid. That's what I've got today. Looks like just one question. Sharon, wouldn't the owner of the share responsibility, so we're talking about where a cow and a pit both cause damage to a third person's cow, wouldn't the owner of the pit share responsibility if the pit was not properly safeguarded? I think we're assuming that when we're talking about a pit, here we are definitely talking about a negligent pit, right? A pit that was in the public domain, that was not safeguarded, where if the cow simply fell into it, the owner of the pit would definitely be responsible. But here, under the circumstances of this case, what we're saying is the ox that fell into that pit wouldn't have fallen into the pit, but for this other cow that pushed it in. And so the owner of the pit can say, listen, my pit was there, okay, but your cow wouldn't have ended up in my pit if Reuven's cow hadn't pushed your cow into it. So that's where there's a share. But you could see that the argument could be made both ways, where Rabbi Nassim says, no, the guy with the cow that died in the pit should be made whole by, half the value from the innocuous ox and the other half from the guy who owns the pit. But the rabbi said no. In that case, it's the ox was the immediate cause of the cow dying, and so you're only entitled to half. Maybe that half is going to get split between the ox, and I think that half is paid by the owner of the ox. But okay, there's different ways to sort of slice that apple. You're making a very good argument. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, tomorrow, Friday, regular time, noon, for a single daf, God willing, since we're back on schedule. And check out our video of the new AT app. It's on the Facebook page right now. Help us finish it. Help us launch it. It's a spectacular app. Our funds are depleted this year. We really need your help to keep the lights burning and get the app released here at Accidental Talmudist. So please donate. Donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Have a good night.